Our third guest is Shri Devinder Sharma Ji. I'm happy to welcome one of the country's brightest minds on agriculture and trade policy amidst us, Shri Devinder Sharma Ji. Shri Devinder Sharma Ji is an agriculture scientist by training, an author, a farm and food policy activist, and above all, a member of my own journalistic fraternity. Devinder Ji worked for Indian Express for years, and we all remember his thought-provoking pieces in the newspaper pertaining to agriculture development.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share my thinking on this particular aspect or particular issue with you all today. It is very strange that in a country like India, we always tend to borrow policies from outside. I've never understood why our economists and policymakers cannot look at our own backyard or look at our own strengths to see what policies we need for this country's future. And I think one of the foremost issues that is concerning this country now is the issue of agriculture and the future of farming in this country. Why I'm saying this is that if you look at the last 4 decades or 5 decades, farmers have been always at the receiving end. I just share a couple of data with you to tell you with what precarious situation farming is being performed in this country. You know, the Economic Survey 2016, just 4 years back, had said that the average income of a farming family in 17 states of India, which means roughly half the country, is 20,000 rupees a year. 20,000 rupees a year would boil down to about less than 1,700 rupees a month. I can't even imagine, I shudder to think how the farming families are surviving in less than 1,700 rupees a month. And this is an official data. And if you look a little earlier than that, an OECD, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, along with a Delhi-based group called ICRIER, had done a study that showed that between 2000 and 2016, Indian farmers had lost 45 lakh crores. 45 lakh crore, and this was in 16 years, and that would boil down to about 2.64 lakh crores every year. This was essentially because farmers were denied the rightful income they deserve. And prior to that also, we have had a series of analysis and data which tells us very clearly that the farm incomes had remained frozen or had been declining over the decades. Now, in a country where 50% of the population is involved with agriculture directly or indirectly, and 70% of the rural households are dependent on agriculture, as several Niti Aayog studies show. I think it is very important to understand that the biggest challenge that agriculture faces or the economy faces is how to pull up farmers from the kind of crisis they are living under or they are living in. Now, the sad part is that instead of coming out and helping farmers to realize a better price or get a higher income in the years to come or in the months to come, we have tend to borrow failed policies from America and Europe. Now, let me illustrate here. Biraj did mention about the huge subsidies that the rich countries provide, but let's look at specifically America and Europe. America has had this free markets operating in agriculture for last 6 to 7 decades. And I remember when Ronald Reagan was the president in the 80s, his agriculture secretary had then gone on record saying that in America, get big or get out. That's the policy America followed. That is what the free markets do to agriculture. The basic idea was to push people out of agriculture into the urban areas. Now, that's the same kind of policy which, of course, Europe followed, and then, of course, it is now being pushed on to developing countries. And our policymakers, my God, you have to really admire them. The economists of this country, mainland economists, they tend to know everything that is happening in Europe and America rather than knowing what actually India needs or what the farmers need. Now, look at America. The chief economist of the US Department of Agriculture has gone on record saying since the 1960s, American farm incomes, if you adjust for inflation, have been on a steep decline. This is what the US Department of Agriculture chief economist says. This is in a country where there is no MSP, where there is no APMC, there is no stock limit on the big retail, and there is a contract farming, there is a commodity trading, and so on and so forth. It's not only one country, one market, but it's one world, one market for American farmers. And yet if you look at it today, the bankruptcy that American farmers are living with or are burdened with is about $425 billion. The rate of suicide in rural America is 45% higher than urban America. This is America. And I think we are not being informed in this country as to why the free markets have failed to perform in a country like America. And we can, of course, talk about Europe. In America, we know, as was mentioned earlier, under the WTO, we have number of boxes and so on. And the green box subsidies that we all talk about, which are non-trade distorting subsidies, which of course is part of the imperfect trading system that Raj talked about, is actually, if you withdraw those subsidies, even the exports collapse. You know, a 2007 study by UNTAD India had shown that if the green box subsidies were withdrawn by the rich countries, the agriculture exports collapsed by about 40% in America, in Canada, and in European Union. The point I'm trying to make is that not only the agriculture, but even agriculture exports are actually dependent on, it's not on markets or the efficiency of the markets, but it's actually dependent on the subsidies. You withdraw the subsidies, even the so-called agriculture export, which is built on the so-called efficiency or the competitiveness of the markets, of course, also falls in those countries. In America, the kind of subsidies that America provides, on average, a farmer receives about $62,000 every year as a subsidy amount. And if you withdraw these subsidies, as I said earlier, the American agriculture is faced with a severe crisis. Not that it is not existing or not it is faced with a serious crisis already, but I think that's a point we need to know, that the markets that we are very proudly talking about in India actually have failed to perform in America and European Union as far as agriculture is concerned. This is something that must be drilled into the Indian thinking, because we have been wrongly informed or wrongly made to believe that markets are efficient. The invisible hand of the market that we all talk about is dependent on the visible hand of subsidies that, of course, we don't want to see, or our economists are not telling us. If you look at the last 25 years between 1995 and 2020 now, in America, this total subsidy provided is $425 billion. And today the bankruptcy that American farmers face is again $425 billion. That tells you, imagine if $425 billion of subsidy was not provided in the last 25 years, what would have been the fate of American agriculture now, given that the markets were to perform and given the kind of focus that we have, or the reliance that we have on markets as the efficient carrier of the economy. Now look at the European Union. I remember several years back attending a conference of UK Food Group in London, and there it was said very clearly that every minute one farmer quits agriculture. Now, this is Europe. Every minute one farmer quits agriculture, despite $100 billion being provided as subsidy support every year in European Union. So much so that the rich countries, the OECD, and the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, a group of 37 rich and developed countries, provide $246 billion of subsidy. That was the latest count we have for 2018. And we know that every WTO ministerial, began, and the heat was always on the subsidies being provided by the rich developed countries. And as was said earlier, the agreement that we signed, of course, was imperfect, and it has been at a disadvantage to developing countries. But nevertheless, the model that we have borrowed now is actually something that we tried earlier. In 2006, I remember there was a lot of excitement in this country, the same kind of excitement, in fact, a little more, I would say, because Bihar at that particular stage in 2006 had thrown away the APMC Act. The argument was that once the APMC Act gets out of the way, we will now have private investments flowing in, private mandis being set up, and of course, price discovery coming in to the rescue of the farming community, which means farmers would get a higher price. It has been 14 years. 14 years is basically, it is a classical case of a lost decade and a half. It's a classical case when even today, this year also, lots of trucks, about more than 200 truckloads of paddy has come into Punjab to be sold here. But this crop is bought at about 800, 1100 to 1200 rupees per quintal in Bihar, then transported all the way to be sold at the MSP in Punjab and also in Haryana. In Uttar Pradesh, the western parts of Uttar Pradesh, paddy is flowing into Haryana. And Haryana has imposed a barrier saying that we will not allow paddy to come into Haryana. The point I'm trying to make is, if these states had also built up an infrastructure which would provide farmers with an assured market and an assured price, I think the fate of Indian economy would have been much, much different. The Indian economy would have been the real, or let's say agriculture would have been the real powerhouse of Indian economy. And that is where I think we should be striving at. That's where our policymakers should have been striving at. But I think from the 2003 to 2007 and onwards, successive governments have been under pressure from these mainline economists who have been wanting the MSP to be done away with, and the APMC mandis to be also were branded as a monopolistic markets, and this needed to be done away with again to see that the markets could operate and markets could provide farmers with a price efficiency or price discovery. But as I said earlier, this was what was not known at that particular time, and even now is that in this country, it's only 6% farmers get the benefit of minimum support price. And bulk of these farmers are in Punjab and Haryana, the food bowl of the country, where, as you know, when we needed food to be produced, we provided them a minimum support price and also set up a network of APMC mandis, which Punjab and Haryana, I think, is something that the rest of the country should have learned from Punjab and Haryana. But the market forces, which means basically the corporate interest, was basically to get away or push these APMC mandis and the MSP out so there could be more exploitation of the farming community. Why I'm saying this is, if only 6% farmers were getting the benefit of MSP, imagine the fate of the farmers, 94% of the remaining farming community. If the markets were so efficient, if the markets had given price, a benevolent price to the farmers, there is no reason why agriculture would have been faced with such a terrible, terrible crisis that exists today. And I think this clearly tells us that the model of agriculture that we are trying to bring in is not conducive to what this country particularly needs, but has been borrowed. And we are trying to resurrect a failed model from America and the European Union. This is, as I said earlier, because mainline economists, as I wrote in my recent article, are basically lazy economists. And it's very easy to borrow policies and then fit into our own Indian scenario. And that is the result that we have seen today, that is bringing farmers onto the streets in Punjab and Haryana. Now, why this so much of agitation in Punjab and Haryana? I think one of the remarkable messages from agitation in Punjab, which I think people in Odisha, people in Chhattisgarh, and people in the remaining that region must understand, is that's the first time, at least that I know of, that farmers in Punjab and Haryana, essentially in Punjab, from where the movement began, this is the first time that it is not linked to any religious or any political ideology. This is the first time that farmers have themselves, come out in anger. And this is also the first time that there were 31 warring groups of farming community, unions, and so on. And it was very difficult to bring them together onto one platform. But this particular issue, the fight to protect their future, has brought them all together. 31 organizations now, under one, not exactly under one banner, but fighting for one particular cause, one same cause. Now, that is something which has actually driven politics, to really stand up for the farming community. It hasn't happened the other way around that normally happens in this country. But here, all the political parties are now gearing up to back up the farmers. We all know for the last several months they have been active on that front. But thanks to the farm movement in Punjab, that this is a unique kind of development that is taking place. And I hope sooner or later this movement will also spread to the rest of the country, because farmers need to understand that their future is at stake. Now look at a statement made by J. Panda, one of the Odisha's politician. In one of his articles in Hindustan Times, he wrote very clearly that if we were to accept, if the farmers' demand of saying that legalize MSP for all crops was to be accepted, then the reforms would be faced with a disaster. He says in as many words that then no company would come forward to invest in agriculture, or to come forward to help or to come into the foray. And similarly, State Bank of India's research paper also says the same, that if we were to provide farmers with a legalized MSP system, then this will be a disaster for the kind of reforms that we are bringing in. Now, it's very sad at a time when industry otherwise says that farmers would be benefiting, they will get a higher price. They are being misled by the Congress party, or being misled by people who do not want farmers to prosper and so on. They are saying that farmers will get a higher income, higher price. A higher price to what? Of course, MSP is the yardstick. So if they're going to get a higher price than MSP, that's what the economists also say. That's what the policymakers also say. If this is true, then what is stopping you to coming and joining farmers in demanding a fourth ordinance or a fourth law, which makes MSP a legal right for farmers across the country? The real freedom for farmers would be when he or she is able to go anywhere in the country, sell his produce, and yet be sure that he or she is going to get at least a base price, which is the minimum support price. The government of India announces the minimum support price for 23 crops every year. And although, as we all know, primarily two crops are the one where it is implemented, paddy and wheat, because that is where the government steps in for procurement. There is a little bit of procurement for cotton, soybean, pulses, and so on. But essentially, it remains confined to wheat and paddy, and that's the belt, Punjab and Haryana, which is the food bowl, where roughly in Punjab, 56,000 crores is what flows in as MSP every year in Punjab. And if you add Punjab and Haryana, roughly 80,000 crores is what flows into Punjab and Haryana. And one reason for the economy doing so well in Punjab and Haryana is the way the farmers have been, producing a very high, with a high productivity every year, and the procurement going up year after year. Now, this is a kind of a model. This is a time-tested module that we have actually prepared for ourselves. I think I have to thank the policymakers in the 60s who actually came up with these two planks of strategies, putting up MSP and putting up APMC markets. Now, that is what the country need to actually expand. There are about 7,000 mandis, APMC mandis in this country. Now, 7,000 APMC mandis, but if we were to set up a mandi providing farmers with a opportunity to take his produce to a mandi or a market yard in 5-kilometer radius, we would need 42,000 APMC mandi yards or APMC regulated mandis. Now, that is where the investment should flow in setting up a 42,000 mandis. Not difficult. If we can spend 6 lakh crore rupees for highways and highways and highways, we don't even know how beneficial they are. But why can't we make a public sector investment as far as setting up or expanding the network of mandis is concerned? Now, imagine if Bihar in those 14 years, when it waited for the private investment to come in, it had instead set up a network of mandis like Punjab does or Punjab has done. The face of Bihar would have been different. It wouldn't have been a labor basket for the country. It would have emerged out of the crisis that it is faced with. Basically, it is also linked to the same situation that Odisha is. Odisha, as was mentioned earlier, 83% of the population is involved in agriculture. Now, for a state like Odisha, I think the module which Jay Panda suggests is completely flawed. And I think it is time we were to stand up and scrutinize, to debate, to deliberate, and then to come up with policies that at least ensure that the farmers get a minimum assured price. I'm not saying that MSP is the correct price, but at least it provides a base price on which at least the farmer can get some semblance of the income that we all talk about should go to farmers. Now, is it possible that we should do that? I think the challenge before us, for all of us to understand, is that we must go by a couple of initiatives that needs to be taken. Let's forget about what has happened in America and Europe, where, as I said earlier, the reforms have failed. Let's try to create our own model of development. Let's try to ensure that agriculture is not deliberately kept impoverished as it has been over the decades. I think something which I would like to present here before I end up is a analysis that I think should be telling us that how we have kept agriculture deliberately impoverished all these decades. I remember a question that has been often asked to me is why is it that the farmers are dying at a pace that we all know about? In the last 25 years or so, in India, 3.64 lakh farmers have committed suicide officially. And we know that the unofficial figures may be several times more, or at least quite significantly more than what has been computed. But the fact of the matter that I think that we need to understand is that in 1970, these were the formative years of Green Revolution. In 1970, the minimum support price for wheat at that particular time was 76 rupees per quintal. That was the time when the school teacher salary, average salary, was about 90 rupees per month. And in the next year, when their salary jumped to about 100 rupees per month, they celebrated it as Diwali. And 76 rupees per month, and if I calculate it in the next 45 years until 2015, in 2015, the wheat price increases to 1,450 rupees per quintal, which is an increase of 19 times. Increase of 19 times takes place in 45 years. I'm talking of the year 2015. To make a comparison of income parity norms, we did a calculation to see in what proportion the salaries of the government employees in other sections increased in the same period. In between 1970 and 2015, the salaries, basic pay and DA, I'm not adding emoluments, the basic pay and DA of government employees went up by 120 to 150 times. The basic pay of college and university professors went up by 150 to 170 times. The basic pay of school teachers went up by 280 to 320 times. Don't forget, their salary was too low in 1970. And as was the income of the farmers, which can be ascertained from the MSP he got, it went up by only 19 times. I'm sure it is something that everyone would be clear about, that if the income of government employees or professors and so on had also increased in the same proportion 19 times, I'm sure many of them would have committed suicide or would have been out of the job. Now, the point I'm trying to make is, imagine year after year, farmers have produced a bountiful harvest. And year after year, the income has been on the decline. In the last 5 years, the Niti Aayog has worked out that between 2011-12 and 2015-16, the real income growth for farmers has been less than 0.5% every year, 0.44% to be exact. Now, I think this tells us very clearly that if agriculture is deliberately kept impoverished, we are refusing to make public sector investment into agriculture just because the economic thinking is, or the economic model is, or the economic design is to push people out of agriculture into the urban areas. Raghuram Rajan, the poster boy of a global economy, had gone on record saying in one of the interviews that the best reforms in India would be when we are able to push people out of farming into urban areas, because urban areas need cheap labor. And I had that time also said that if the idea is to create the Hari Mazdoor in the cities and we treat that as employment generation or as a part of the economic growth, I think the entire model of economic growth has to be re-looked into. And I think that is something we need to understand, that our policymakers are actually being driven by policies which are being laid outside the country. Last but not the least, I just share a development which I think the country need to know. I remember in 1996, when I was with the Indian Express, I attended a conference at the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, and at that particular conference, the then Vice President of Sustainable Development for World Bank, Dr. Ismail Sarageldin, had said that the World Bank estimates in the next 20 years, which means by the year 2015, the number of people migrating from the rural to the urban areas in India in the next 20 years would be equal to twice the combined population of UK, France, and Germany. The combined population of UK, France, and Germany was 200 million. It still is 200 million. The World Bank had estimated that 400 million people will migrate from rural to the urban areas in India by the year 2015. That is what our successive government has been focusing on. Unfortunately and sadly, whichever party came into power, they have been trying to push people out of agriculture into the urban areas. And I've always called these 400 million people, of course, the 400 million people didn't move, but I've always called them as agriculture refugees, because we made agriculture deliberately, as I said earlier, deliberately kept it impoverished. So people were forced to quit agriculture, come into the cities. And now look at it. 2 days of lockdown, was imposed, and we have seen millions of people walking back hundreds of kilometers to reach their villages. Now, these were the people that we thought we had done a remarkable job by moving them from the villages into the urban areas. But 2 days of lockdown, they found it pertinent to go back into their villages. 8 crore people had gone back. And that tells us that the model of development that India has followed in these last few decades was not the model designed for India. It was a model, as was mentioned earlier, designed to hook us up into the global trade and global economic thinking. And that is how we have actually been doing damage to our own economy. I think the challenge now is to see how agriculture can be rebooting, how agriculture can reboot the entire economy, because that's the only sector which has the potential. We have seen from the first quarter report of the economic growth also. But also at the same time, I think what is important is here is an opportunity for us to move that swing back, or to that reverse migration that the country witnessed calls for a reverse in the direction of the policies that we need to follow. Let us not be ashamed of what this country's strength lies in. Let us try to rebuild on those strengths. If we have a manpower in agriculture, the bigger challenge should be how to make agriculture more profitable and economically viable. And I think the best way to do is two things that we must do. One, expand the mandi network in the country. As I said earlier, 42,000 mandis is what this country needs. And then come up, make MSP for all 23 crops, because 23 crops will cover 80% of the gross crop area of this country. So if you ensure that 23 crops for which MSP is announced, it becomes a legal instrument, it means that no trading takes place below that MSP. Then, of course, at later stages, we can talk about how to increase that MSP price and so on. But I think if these two steps were to be taken, that's the way for Atmanirbhar Bharat. That's the way for Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. Let us therefore understand, whether it is Odisha, whether it is Punjab, whether it is Bihar, whether it is Karnataka, the answer in development, which is holistic, which is, as we all say, inclusive, lies in developing agriculture, making it a future powerhouse of the country's economy. Is it possible? Yes, it is possible, provided all the professionals who are listening to this seminar or webinar are able to think beyond box. I think this laziness that we have always imbibed by just thinking that markets are the answer, I think we have to get out of it and try to go look beyond this, beyond the box, to understand what this country needs. So in my understanding, as I said repeatedly, the way forward is that agriculture is the only sector which has the potential to revitalize and to reboot the country's economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Devinder ji. It was nice listening to you. आपने हमें बहुत अच्छा बताया आपका. I think we wouldn't have found someone better who would have given us a clear picture of the state of agriculture in India as well as in Odisha.